All right, in Acts chapter 18, this is where we see Paul go to Corinth, and he spends a great deal of time in Corinth, even though it's in Corinth that he finally says, forget the Jews, I can't even handle the abuse anymore. But he's able to stay in Corinth for a long time, just preaching to the Gentiles in Corinth. He eventually leaves and goes to Galatia, and he just preaches around that region. And so we get just the very sparse timeline that gets filled in later. If we go on to read Corinthians and Galatians and some of these other books, then we learn more about what he was teaching there and what was happening there. And I wanted to talk about a tiny little detail of Acts chapter 18, just something that kind of struck me as interesting and that I think unlocks an interesting principle. And so that is in Acts chapter 18, verse 18. It says, Paul stayed on in Corinth for some time. Then he left the brothers and sailed for Syria, accompanied by Priscilla and Aquila. Before he sailed, he had his hair cut off at Cenchrea because of a vow he had taken. Okay, so this is a tiny detail. It almost feels like, why is it even mentioned? Like, we don't know what the vow was. We don't know why cutting his hair off had to do with this vow. So it almost feels like an odd and random detail, but I feel like there's very few details in the Bible that are truly random. And I guess what struck me about it is that we have this story in the Old Testament, a famous story, which Paul would have known because as Saul, he was a zealot, right? And so he knew what was in the Old Testament. And so we know that for Samson was not allowed to cut his hair. If Samson cut his hair, then that would mean that he would lose all of his power and strength, and it was the way that he was honoring God, was keeping his hair long, and to cut his hair would have been a sin for him. But here we have Paul specifically cutting his hair due to a vow that he made, which we must assume based on what he's doing in his ministry and life, that this was a vow he's making to God. We don't get the details. It doesn't elaborate on what the vow is, but it would just be really easy for us as Christians to say, oh, well, God once said that someone shouldn't cut his hair, so none of us should cut our hair. God once had this law, so we have to follow that law. It's just we a lot of times want to assume that what God has required of man, he will always require of man throughout all time. But this is just another example where that's not the case, where it looks like Paul felt led by the Holy Spirit to cut his hair as a sign of a vow that he made, even though in the past, cutting someone's hair was a sin, right? We don't have a God that lives in a box. We don't have a God that lives by our rules or that even sets up rules that we know to be permanent and lasting and that we can live by. We're supposed to live by the Spirit. And so to me, this was an encouraging example of Paul living by the Spirit, not getting caught up in the things that God has done in the past, but discerning through the Spirit what God is doing in that very moment. And I think that's encouraging and something that we should remember, that it's not enough just to know what God has done in the past or what God is doing right now with other people. It's not enough to know what God expects of your friends or your spouse or your boss or your pastor. You need to know what God's asking of you in this moment in time and live by that and honor God in those things. Okay, I get excited when we talk about living by the Spirit because it's a mystery, and a mystery means an adventure, and that's exciting for me. Okay, read Acts chapter 19 for tomorrow, and we will discuss that tomorrow. But in the meantime, tell me what you appreciated about Acts chapter 18. I literally talked about half of one verse, so there are 27 and a half verses for you to analyze, think about, talk about in the comments.